Alright, welcome back everybody. This video will be going up on Wednesday, April 1st, April Fool's Day. I hope you got caught up on some work yesterday, which was supposed to be just a teacher work day. Today's class, I would typically start with these questions and ask you guys to discuss if you agree or disagree with these statements. The first one says, when you were born, your mind is a blank page. Your personality is shaped only by your experiences. That is part of this old debate that people have, often in psychology. Is part of our personality something we're born with? Is it innate? Or is our personality based on our experiences, everything that we see, all the interactions we have? Most psychologists agree it's probably a little bit of both. Things that you're born with, your personality, you kind of come somewhat into the world with, and other things are based on your experience. But this is a question that I'll explain why I'm starting with that one. 2, people are naturally selfish and cruel. Life is survival of the fittest. Is that something you agree with or disagree with? That most people are unkind, only out to help themselves, and mean? Or are you somebody who thinks that people are pretty much good, and given the chance will be kind and good to others? 3 says, a government headed by a king or queen is the best type of government. I'm going to guess that most people now disagree with that statement, but for years and years, that was the way most countries were run. A king or queen at the top, in control. 4 says, freedom of speech is our most important freedom. Well, in America, for sure, it is a speech, a right, a freedom that people hold dear. It doesn't exist everywhere in the world the same way it does in the United States, but you might not think it's the most important one. You might think freedom of religion is very important, or freedom of the press. The reason why I started with these statements is these are the types of things that Enlightenment philosophers were debating or talking about. And some did believe that we all come into the world with a blank slate. Some thought that human beings were cruel and selfish by nature. Others thought that human beings were naturally good. Some believed a king with complete power would be the best type of ruler. Others thought that being able to elect your leaders would be better. And many held the value or the freedom of speech to be very, very important. So you should have, based on the activities from Active Classroom, gotten more details about these famous philosophers like John Locke and Voltaire and Rousseau. I'm going to give you more information about them today. All I'm asking you to do is write down the notes, and really I'm just going to read through a few paragraphs about each one of these guys. At the end of it, there'll be a little introduction to the concept of absolutism and these 2 rulers, Louis XIV and Peter the Great. There'll be a little chart for you to fill in at the end of the note sheet, but that shouldn't take too much time, and I'll attach a reading for you to use for that. So the first philosopher here is called Thomas Hobbes, and I'm just going to read this information and add a few details. It says in 1651, English philosopher Thomas Hobbes published a book on government. According to Hobbes, at one time people lived without any government. Their lives were short and unhappy. At some point, people agreed to give up their freedom to a ruler to gain order and safety. So he felt like without governments, people were constantly attacking each other, people were unsafe. And in order to become safe, they agreed to give up certain freedoms to a ruler to gain that order and safety. He thought that an unwritten agreement existed between the ruler and the ruled, basically between the people and the person in charge. He called it a social contract. Under this agreement, people agreed to obey the rulers even if they ruled poorly. Hobbes said that kings needed absolute power, complete power, to keep people from fighting among themselves. For Hobbes, order was more important than freedom. Nevertheless, Hobbes argued that reason, not religion, should direct people's lives. Now, what made this man feel like we needed rulers with complete control and that we had to give up our freedom for safety? Well, it explains here what his experience was. Hobbes was alive during the chaos of the English Civil War. He argued that for ordinary people to have decent lives, they needed a very strong government to keep them safe and orderly. A government with the strength of a sea monster. So the title of Hobbes' book was Leviathan. an old name for a sea monster. So having seen the horror of these civil wars in England made him believe the only way to keep order and peace was to have a powerful ruler with complete control. Probably the most famous of these philosophers that we'll learn about, and another Englishman, is John Locke. And John Locke is very, very famous because he inspired the leaders who created the government in the United States. So we often learn about him when we talk about the US government. It says John Locke was another English philosopher who lived through the English Civil War. In his 2 treatises of government, he stated that people, through reason, could govern themselves. Locke also argued that a contract existed between government and people. In this contract, the people gave up some rights to the government, but kept their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. The government in turn existed to protect these natural rights, which were superior to all laws and governments. Now that's a key phrase there when it talks about natural rights and life, liberty, and property. That will inspire Thomas Jefferson, who's famous for writing the Declaration of Independence in America. He took those ideas, changed it slightly. He said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is what Jefferson changed it to. But again, he borrowed heavily from these Enlightenment philosophers and people like John Locke. It says, accordingly, Locke rejected absolute monarchy as a form of government, so he disagreed with Hobbes. He believed individual rights are the foundation of a society. He argued for private property and stood against taxation without representation. The idea that the government should not be allowed to tax you unless you have some control over your leaders. He also believed that subjects had the right to overthrow an oppressive government. He said if your leaders are not treating you the right way, you should be allowed to get rid of them, start a new government. Another idea that inspires people in America when they decide to have a revolution and get rid of English control. We're building up to that. A third Enlightenment philosopher here is a man named Baron de Montesquieu. He's a French philosopher, and he studied the government of ancient Rome and many governments of his own time. In 1748, he published a book about his studies called The Spirit of the Laws. Montesquieu thought that the best monarchs used their wealth and power for the good of everyone. Virtue, or goodness to one another, held the republic together. Montesquieu said that people in a republic needed to elect leaders who would serve the good of the community. Montesquieu admired the English government of the 1700s. It divided power into 3 branches. Parliament made the laws, that's the legislative branch. The king enforced the laws, that's the executive branch. The courts interpreted the laws, that's the judicial branch. Montesquieu said that separating these powers kept each branch of the 3 branches, or each of the 3 branches, from becoming too powerful. Each branch checked and balanced the power of the other 2 branches. If this sounds familiar, it's because that's the way the government in the United States works. Once again, leaders in the US, when they were forming the government and writing the Constitution, were inspired by these Enlightenment philosophers, and Montesquieu's idea that power should be divided or separated into different branches of government makes its way into the US Constitution. And we have those same 3 branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Voltaire is another French philosopher from the Enlightenment, and he has a big influence as well. He wrote histories, poetry, and over 50 plays. He used many of these to criticize the wealth and privileges of French kings and nobles and the Catholic Church. Twice, King Louis XV of France put Voltaire in jail to silence him or stop him from speaking out. But Voltaire defended a person's right to think and speak freely, so that idea of freedom of speech. He is reported to have said, "I do not agree with a word you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." What he's saying is, even if I don't like what you're saying, I think you should be allowed to speak your mind. That's another key freedom that Americans hold very dearly. There are plenty of people that have terrible ideas that are allowed to say them, even if they're hateful, because we protect that freedom of speech. It means we have to allow people to speak their mind even if we don't agree with them. It says Voltaire also supported freedom of religion. According to Voltaire, free speech, a free press, and freedom of religion were rights that belonged to every person, and enlightened governments had to respect these rights. Because Voltaire's ideas were used in creating the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, most Americans probably most appreciate his contribution to the Enlightenment conversation. So people remember him because, again, that First Amendment that protects freedom of speech is something that all Americans are familiar with. Another philosopher living in France at the time was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau said that people had once done only good things. They began to do bad things when civilization developed. So this is the opposite of what Hobbes had said. Hobbes believed people were all born selfish and greedy, and civilization gave them responsibility and order. Rousseau says, nope, it's the other way around. He turned Hobbes' idea upside down. He said that people were born good, and civilization makes us evil. His quote is, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." So Rousseau felt like civilization having to abide by these rules and these governments is what made people behave badly. Rousseau believed that peasants were just as good as kings and nobles. He said that no one was better than anyone else, so no one should have any special privileges or rights. All were equal, another idea that inspires leaders in America and also leaders in France. So later many leaders of the French Revolution would use his ideas to abolish the nobility, to get rid of these wealthy people who were born into this life of luxury. Rousseau published his book on government in 1762. In it, he disagreed with Hobbes and Locke and their idea of a contract between the ruler and the ruled. Rousseau said that in order to get along, people made a contract with each other, not with the ruler. He thought that shared customs, traditions, and values held a community of people together. Rousseau called these shared customs, traditions, and values the general will. According to Rousseau, a community expressed what it wanted through this general will. Because of that, Rousseau favored rule by the majority through a direct democracy, so he believed that people should be allowed to vote for themselves, directly on issues, directly on laws. Now this last section you'll have to take notes on, but I'm giving you an introduction to absolutism. So many of these Enlightenment philosophers would inspire the leaders of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the people that were fighting to make big changes in how their governments worked. But before this age of revolutions, here's where I'll read this to you. The most common form of government in Europe was a monarchy. That means rule by a king or queen. Great Britain and France were both ruled by absolute monarchs. And in an absolute monarchy, or absolutism, rulers have complete control over the decisions made about their kingdoms. Monarchs were able to maintain this strict rule because they believed they were God's representatives on earth. This concept, called divine right, was often used as justification for harsh and unpopular policies initiated by the monarch. Think about different periods in history that we've studied, going back to ancient Egypt and the pharaohs, or the Sumerians and their god kings. Many civilizations believed that their rulers had been chosen by God, that the power came from God to rule. In China, the mandate of heaven. There are many examples of this. All the way up into the 1700s, these rulers of Europe were still maintaining they had the divine right, that they were chosen by God to rule. But that's going to be challenged. It says, following the age of revolutions, most European countries became limited monarchies, which meant that the monarch was still the head of state, but his or her power was limited by legislative bodies, such as Congress or Parliament. Not all of the revolutions led to limited monarchies. Some led to republics, in which the people chose their leaders. An example of this would be the United States. We're going to get to that, get to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But before we do, we're going to take a closer look at some examples of absolute monarchy. Rulers who ruled absolutely, with complete control. And the two that you're going to look at are Louis XIV and Peter the Great. If you look over here, some differences between a limited monarchy and an absolute monarchy. In a limited monarchy, there's a constitution, there's a written set of laws. And those laws are written by people like a parliament or like a Congress, often elected leaders who are going to essentially create the rules that govern the society. In an absolute monarchy, there's no constitution, there's no parliament. The monarch has complete control over the laws that are passed. What about in a limited monarchy? What role do aristocrats play? Well, aristocrats are upper class wealthy people. They have legal rights and privileges. They typically would be members of the parliament. In an absolute monarchy, they're controlled by the monarch. Now here are some examples of limited monarchy. Henry IV in France, William and Mary in England, Maria Theresa in Austria. Other examples of absolute monarchies: Suleiman, if you remember Suleiman the Magnificent in the Ottoman Empire, Louis XIV from France, and Peter the Great in Russia. So those two, Louis XIV and Peter the Great, you're going to take a closer look at. Now I'm going to attach a reading, and it's only a few pages. The first section will talk about Louis XIV as ruler of France and why he's an example of an absolute monarch. And then the second section will talk about Peter the Great. What you're going to fill in is this little chart that's at the end of the notes. So you're going to fill in which country he ruled, which you already know. Louis is France, Peter the Great is Russia. The time period when he's in power, you should be able to find that. Or even if you go back here, you can find it. And the last part you're going to have to use a reading for, I said list 2 examples of times when this ruler exercised complete control over his people. So a few examples of this person being an absolute monarch. You should be able to find that there. And then there are other good resources you can use for this as well. Okay, but that's all I'm asking you to do for today. After today's lesson, we'll fast forward and we'll get to the revolutions that are going to happen in England, in America, and in France, how these Enlightenment philosophers are going to inspire people to demand greater freedoms and more rights, and it's going to lead to violent revolutions to make those changes happen. All right? Hope everyone's still doing okay. Remember, send me a message, shoot me an email, even if you just want to say hi, I'll be here. All right? Have a good one.